How do you open a conversation with someone who might have a negative opinion of you? I'm Andrew, I'm the Flannel Philosopher, and I love to discuss how you open a conversation with someone who maybe is not the biggest fan of you. Maybe justly, maybe unjustly. Well, certainly the most natural way to go into a conversation like that is to be defensive. It's like, well, I think I know what you're thinking about me, but here's the real story. We try to explain, we try to convince, we try to sell ourselves, we try to explain why we're different, why they misunderstood. And it comes off poorly for a couple of reasons. One, I think it already feels like we're attacking the other person, which nobody likes. Two is it comes across maybe a little thin-skinned, like that maybe they weren't thinking that, maybe they don't have a problem with us, and we assume these things, then we're actually kind of maybe putting a bad reputation on them. Like we're accusing them falsely without saying so, that they think negatively towards us. I've never found that works really well. Or you can ignore it, which that is even more awkward, because then you're like, well, does the other person have a problem? Does the other person not have a problem? How do we negotiate that? The reality is problems occur. Problems between two people occur. Sometimes it's your fault, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's circumstances, sometimes it's a misunderstanding. But, so if you can't be defensive, if you can't go on the attack, well, how do you open a conversation like that? Well, I read this one approach that I've tried a number of times, and it works really, really well for me. And I don't know what the original person called it, and honestly, I can't even remember what the author or where I heard this. So I'm not trying to steal it. I'm just, full disclaimer, I use it and I can't remember where I picked it up. But I call the approach shooting the moon. So let's say I think that they think I am slightly inconsiderate and rude. Well, what I'm gonna say is like, oh man, I am sure that you think I'm the most inconsiderate and the rudest person, and I just deliberately wanted to ignore you. So what I did is I kind of assumed that they think maybe way worse of me than what I actually believe that they think. Now, you say, well, isn't that being defensive? No, I'm not being defensive. I just put it out there. I just say, hey, I'm sure you think that I'm the worst person and I ignored you intentionally and you're hurt by that, and I'm sorry. And more often than not, one of two things will happen. Either A, more often than not, they will think, no, I don't think that bad. Like, I mean, my feelings were a little hurt, or I was a little bothered, I had expectations that weren't met. But I mean, not the worst person, and they're actually talking to me now. And so what they will do, both in their minds and verbally, is they will actually correct themselves. They will actually have an accurate view and state accurately what they think. It's interesting because often when we try to be defensive, we're trying to correct the way they think, but it doesn't really work, because in fact, when we try to correct somebody, they often more go the other direction. So by putting it out there, they bring that down into the accurate spot. Like I said, sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes we do things that are wrong. Sometimes we don't fulfill everything we meant to, out of we got too busy, we overcommitted, we didn't understand the objectives properly, we misspoke. All of that can happen. But when we make it worse than it possibly is, they'll usually bring it down. They'll kind of adjust that down themselves, both mentally and verbally. And they'll say, oh no, I mean, I was disappointed, but it's okay. And so what that allows them to do is self-correct to where they actually think this is. Now, that doesn't mean it's gonna self-correct to them thinking like, oh yeah, you're the greatest guy ever. No, there might have been a problem, but it allows for them to actually self-correct and really focus in on what the issue is. Now, I said there's two approaches or two outcomes of this. One of them is the self-correction piece. The other approach the other alternative to the self-correction is maybe they actually think you're that bad. That's not great. But the reality is, if that's where they think you're at, well then at least you're meeting them there. So versus you being down here trying to pull them down to this, and they're like, no, you're this bad. It's like, well, at least we can meet there and have a conversation of where do we go from here? Like, what next? What are the next steps that we need to take? And so, like I said, I've found shooting the moon to be very, very helpful. Sometimes you go into those awkward conversations and you're just like, man, I'm guessing this is the last conversation you want to be having. Is it the last? No, probably not. It's probably not their favorite though, but they can correct that down and say, hey, at least we're willing to have a conversation. So I use shooting the moon when I go into a conversation when I think the other person's view towards me or my actions is potentially negative or highly negative, not as a way of trying to trick them out of it, but a way of helping them actually frame what they're really concerned about, what they're really bothered by. And often it's not as bad as that maybe they've built it up in their minds, but even if it is that bad, at least we're meeting there and we're able to have a conversation. It's not a conversation we want to have, but that happens a lot in life. And so at least we're having the conversation, we're connecting, we're even agreeing maybe on where we're starting. And then we could actually put more productivity on where do we go from here versus them trying to convince you how bad you are and you trying to convince them how bad you're not. Nobody wins in that. So how about you try shooting the moon? I'd love to hear your comments or feedback on that.